Jesus took the loaves and he gave thanks. And then he gave them to the disciples to distribute. And they all had their fill. And then Jesus said, "Gather the fragments that are left over, so that nothing will be wasted." A few weeks ago, a family, the siblings of one of our deceased parishioners, came in to say hello because they were back in town and they were busy cleaning out their mother's home and all of the belongings and kind of finalizing the details of her estate. And so they stopped in to visit, to again say thank you to the parish for the many ways in which we as a community of believers reached out to them. And they had some money for masses and some memorial in memory of their mother. And so as they were visiting, I said, "So how are things going?" And they said, "Well, these days are difficult. We're busy, dividing up the belongings of our mother. And so fortunately, so far, we haven't had any fights over the things that our mother had in the home." But they said, as we're dividing up the things of her house, we of course are sharing stories. We come across things that we see and they bring back memories. And of course, they bring back with them tears, as well as oftentimes they said great, great laughter. And as I'm listening to the story, I understand it, as no doubt most of you gathered in this space tonight can understand it as well. Because who of us hasn't had that experience of having to divide up the belongings, and then of course having to do the reminiscing and the remembering, because those belongings oftentimes remind us of an experience, of an event, of an encounter, of a conversation that took place with the one that we loved who is now gone. What that family was sharing with me that day was a story of multiplication. It's the miracle of the multiplications of loaves and fish that continues to happen, my friends, every single day of our lives. But oftentimes we look upon this miracle that we just heard in John's gospel. By the way, just a little Bible trivia. I think it's always important because you and I oftentimes think about the four gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we see them as just being the same, and the stories are the same. But my friends, they're not the same. What is the same? Believe it or not, for those of you into Bible trivia, here you go. You can trick your neighbors and your friends. It is the multiplication story is the only miracle that appears in all four gospels. The only miracle that Jesus did that appears in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so much important was that miracle, that's why two of the gospel writers, I'll let you look it up, I'm not going to tell you the answer. Two of the gospel writers actually have Jesus multiplying not once, but twice. The other important thing to remember about John's account that we just heard a few moments ago is that it's Jesus who wants to do the feeding, and it's a young boy who supplies the barley loaves and the fish. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's the disciples themselves who have the food. But in John's account, it's a young boy who Andrew recognizes, one of Jesus' disciples, who has these 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. So the young boy basically has 5 barley breadsticks and 2 anchovies. What John wants us to realize is not only the smallness, the small quantity of food that is available there, but it comes to Jesus and the disciples through another form of smallness, through a young boy, through an outsider, because children had no rights back then, and children were indeed outsiders. So the food comes from an outsider, the food comes from an insignificant individual, and yet it is in that smallness that the young boy provides Jesus these 5 barley breadsticks and 2 anchovies. And so what does Jesus do? Why, he takes them, and first and foremost, he gives thanks. He gives thanks for what little there is. Because the disciples are struggling with how they're going to feed all these people. Because they're using their minds, which is the wrong thing to do when it comes to the multiplication story. Because the opposite of multiplication is, come on, math wizards, the other half of the opposite of multiplication is division. So the disciples are dividing. Imagine now they're making the division going on in their heads. It's like, okay, we got 5 barley bread sticks and we got 2 anchovies divided by 5,000 people. It ain't enough. They've quickly done the math. It isn't enough. But Jesus invites them not to enter into the form of division that comes from the head. He wants them to multiply that can only come from the heart. Multiplication only comes from the heart. So let's get back to the story I started today's homily with, the story of the family, the siblings who were dividing their mother's belongings. And in the course of the division, by the way, the family said, our mother was old, and so there really wasn't much left. Fortunately, she had gotten rid of all of it or most of it before she had died. So all of a sudden, they're dividing the limited resources that were still there. And they discovered in doing so that there was more than enough. And so they began to gather the fragments. To gather the fragments that their mother had left behind in the feeding of them through all those years and decades that she had with them. And so they begin to gather the fragments so that nothing will be wasted in the sharing of the stories and the memories. Why they begin to encounter that, why even though their mother is gone, they still have all of these baskets full. They're overflowing. And they begin to discover the miracle of the multiplication, that it's happened again and again and again. I'm coming to realize that the old statement that you can't be in 2 places at the same time is actually wrong. I think we can be in 2 and 3 and 5 and 10 and 20 and 30 and 50 places at the same time. Not physically, but we can be in different places at the same time because, why? Because you and I have chosen to take what God has given us, even though we think it's not much. And we've chosen to give thanks as Jesus has done, and as that elderly woman, that mother did for her children. And she gave thanks, and what did she do with it? Why, she broke it and she distributed it to her kids. And you and I are invited to do the same. What little we have, whatever it is, even though we think it's not enough, we extend the smile, we give the helping hand, we do the common courtesies that are part of living here on earth. We respect one another, and in those small gestures, why, believe it or not, part of us is left with those people that we give kindness and compassion, a smile and laughter, and tell a story with. And so therefore, we begin to realize that even after we are long gone, hopefully, people will continue to gather the fragments that have been left behind. And they too will discover abundance. Why? Because we as disciples of Christ chose likewise to not be afraid of only having 5 barley breadsticks and 2 anchovies. That even though that's all we've got, we choose to go out into the world each and every day. And we take what God has given us and we give thanks. And in giving thanks, we give it away. And in giving it away, why, others' lives are transformed. They are loved and they are forgiven and they are experiencing acts of kindness, and most importantly, they experience the miracle in a new way. They find out that the multiplication of loaves and fish doesn't just appear in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John's gospel, but it appears here in Candy, Ohio County, in our own communities, and in our own homes. So, my friends, where are we going to get enough food for all these people to eat? Well, just look within, and you'll discover an abundance. You'll discover that multiplication has more power than division.